for joining me for the Plant Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Howie Jacobson. Today's conversation explores two important questions that we hardly ever ask. One is, what is real? And the other is, what matters? And more particularly, who matters? My guest, Jamie Woodhouse, is the founder of sentientism.info, which is an organization devoted to promoting what he calls sentientism, which is based on these two ideas that what is real can be discovered through evidence and reason, and we don't have to rely on supernatural stories. And what matters, or who matters, is all sentient beings, not just human beings, but any being that has the capacity to experience pleasure, pain, experience anything. And so I wanted to explore those two topics because I'm not sure that I totally agree with them, but I'm not sure that I totally don't either. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Without further ado, Jamie Woodhouse, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Howard. Great.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about a new word for me, sentientism. First of all, did I say it right?
Yeah, that's a great start. Your pronunciation was perfect. It has a few too many syllables, but you got it.
Okay, good. Because as an American, I assume that my pronunciation is just going to be sloppy compared to clipped British way.
Not at all.
So before we get into, I think I heard a sentient being in your background. Just
she is. I'm highly confident she's sentient. This is Luna. Luna, what's up? We'll see if she participates anymore. Hopefully, she'll calm down a little bit.
Okay, that's all. It's all good. So let's start. I've been listening to your podcast, and I love how you.
Oh, great! Thank you.
You introduced one of your guests by asking, "So tell people who haven't heard of you what they should know." So I'll steal that and throw it at you.
Yeah, of course. So I guess by trade I'm a consultant, but I also do a range of volunteering and NGO projects and other things. But I guess my main project is why I'm here to talk to you today, is promoting building community around and amateurishly developing this worldview or philosophy called sentientism. So that's me in a nutshell. And I live in deep North London. We're not really in London. We're sort of on the outskirts with my family, including Luna behind me. So.
Okay. Is that like Hemel Hempstead?
We're not far from there. We're a bit close to London now. We're in Edgware. So we're still on the tube line, on the metro line, but only just. We're on the last stop. So if you fall asleep, we're where you might wake up. Okay,
gotcha. I used to get off at Finchley Road.
Yeah. We're sort of between Finchley Road and Hemel Hempstead, if you like. Yeah, that's pretty close.
Very good. So let's tee it up with like what is sentientism? And I think you answered that in your podcast. You say that there's two questions, right? What's real and what matters?
Yeah.
So is basically that sentientism in a nutshell?
Well, sentientism is trying to answer those two questions, and I think they're probably two of the most interesting and deepest questions there are. What's real and what should we believe? But equally as important, what should we care about? What matters morally? What do good and bad even mean? So there's loads of ways of answering those two questions, of course. But sometimes people bundle them up into a worldview or a philosophy that tries to say, look, this is a way of thinking about life. This is a way about thinking about morality that we can package up. And I summarize sentientism as, in one sentence, as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So the question about what's real and what to believe, it says we should take a naturalistic approach where we use evidence and reasoning to, with humility, engage honestly with reality and try to understand it as well as we can, knowing that's always going to be imperfect. So that's the evidence and reason part, answering what's real. And then the compassion for sentient beings answers the moral question of, as we look around the world, which entities matter? Does this computer mouse matter? Does my mug matter? Does Luna the puppy matter? Do you and I matter? And sentientism, the clue is in the name, is that it suggests we should use this characteristic or this quality of sentience to decide which entities matter, which should get moral consideration, which should we feel compassion for. And sentience in its simplest terms is the capacity to have experiences. To suffer, to flourish, to feel good things or feel bad things. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's it. Evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings.
Okay. So one of the challenges I had when trying to prepare for this podcast is I kind of slept through philosophy classes.
Yeah.
Like they rarely seemed particularly useful or interesting to me. But then in hearing you talk to your guest, you're throwing around Hume and Kant and various people who's like I probably passed a test on them at one point, but I feel like I don't really have a grounding. So when you've talked about sort of the limitations of ethical humanism and your upbringing is sort of Christian light maybe. Can we set sort of like a historical stage for like if there is this new philosophical movement that you're promoting?
Yeah.
Like, where does it come from and what is it in response to? Like, why do we even need one?
Yeah, absolutely. So, wow, that's a big question, because in a way it's quite a new term. It probably was first used, I think, in 1971. So it hasn't been around that long. But at the same time, the ideas within it are extremely old and go back thousands of years. And you might even argue, could be pre-human. So let me answer your last question first, which is, why do we even need a worldview? Because some people might say, well, it's not really necessary. One, I just quite like having a really simple way of describing a way of looking at the world that I think is appropriate and good. But the reason I think worldviews are important is because whether we think we have them or not, everybody has them. And every human decision is in some way based on that worldview, on that way of thinking. It's based on, of course, our genetics and the way our brains are configured, but it's also configured our decisions are also based on the values, the things we think are important, the things we care about, and they're based on what we believe to be true as well. So to my mind, whether people think they have a worldview or not, they do have one, and that underpins almost every decision we take. So in a way, my hope with sentientism is that if we can popularize and persuade more people to adopt a really strong, robust, compassionate worldview, that would then have a knock-on impact onto every decision, humans take. So that's why I think worldviews are important. But I can come back to, I guess, the roots of the idea, and it might be useful to explain, how I got to it personally as well, because that might make it a little bit more.
That would be great.
Realistic, because I share your frustration with much of philosophy. I think lots of it is interesting, but it does feel like so much of philosophy has almost skipped over these really deep, important, everyday questions and has gone on to all sorts of other crazy shit. And that can be fun, right? But as with you, like, how is that really relevant when you bring it back to everyday decisions that we're trying to take to get through life and to make the world a better place? And I think many philosophers have sort of skipped over these basics and gone on to abstruse, weird, arcane trolley problems. And I want to drag people back and say, look, we haven't answered these two questions correctly yet, so let's try and do that.
Yeah, I remember in college there was a one line, and I don't think I was even taking the course. I was just talking to a roommate who was taking the course, who was trying to describe John Rawls' theory of justice, and it was the idea of pretend you're going to be born onto this planet and you have no idea who you're going to be.
Yeah,
that was the first bit of philosophy that actually woke something in me. And said, oh, that's
a veil of ignorance. And, if you don't know which state you're going to be, which type of person, your background, your country, your level of poverty, your class, your race, your gender, your sex, you don't know any of those things. You're just going to be randomly dropped in. How would you order that society to be fair? Yeah.
Yeah. And that, and then comparing that to, some of the philosophy I did stumble upon, sort of logical philosophy and, Saul Kripke, names and naming. I never understood why it was important. And, I don't understand why lots of things are important, quantum physics and cellular, whatever, but doesn't mean they're not important, but it never seemed to me to be the basis for a deliberate life.
Yeah. And I think the part of the idea behind sentientism, in a way, it's not really competing with all of those detailed works of philosophy, because many of them might fit within the structure and they might fit on top of sentientism as a platform, because it's so basic. I mean, it literally is just evidence and reason and compassion for all sentient beings. It leaves lots of space for loads of different ethical philosophies or even approaches to epistemology that you could then layer on top of that. So there's still plenty to fight about and argue about. And one thing that's interesting is that as you look through a lot of the different particular moral philosophies, you look at, John Rawls's thinking, or you look at people who've been thinking about human rights, or you look at people who've been thinking about maybe a feminist care ethic or a relational approach to ethics, or a deontological approach where, you work out rules and you follow rules, or as you mentioned, Kant, this idea of humans being ends in themselves that have their own value that needs to be respected under all situations. You can take all of that sort of smorgasbord of different views and you can still apply those in different ways. But what sentientism says is that stuff shouldn't just apply to humans. You need to recognize and grant moral consideration for all sentient beings. So you can still take a rights approach, or you can still apply rules, or you can have a care ethic, or you can think in a utilitarian way. But if you want to align with sentientism, you've got to recognize that it's not just humans that matter. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a sort of, you might call it a really pluralistic, very simple platform which you can build on. And it's really interesting to take a lot of the people who've thought about human ethics and just go, well, why doesn't that work? For the veil of ignorance, what happens if we also hide species behind that? So you could appear in the world as a farmed animal or a wild animal. What would that change about how you'd order the world? So you can reuse a lot of that human ethics, I think, and just broaden it out. But the way I got to it personally was, and people come to this in many different ways. For me, I grew up, with a Christian worldview, and it wasn't a pretty strong part of our life growing up. It was just the default for my parents and the community we lived in. I didn't choose it. It was just, what I was told to believe and what I assumed was true. And I guess I went through a two-part process in my early teenage years. One was just learning about the history of Christianity and all the different sects and parts of it, and all of the other religions and non-religious worldviews, and seeing it in a sociological context. And that, I guess, helped me to see that, to my mind, those religions were very clearly human fabrications rather than a reflection of reality. So as I was spotting, looking for the evidence, looking for the coherence, looking for the consistency, I just didn't find it. The claims that were being made about heaven and hell and a deity and so on just didn't stack up. So on that sort of evidence and reason side, I guess moved to a atheistic or an extreme agnostic way of thinking about the world. But I also saw, I guess, some ethical challenges in some interpretations of those religious worldviews as well. So, threatening young children with hell for circumstances outside of their control seemed, unethical to me. And there were some more classical things, the social conservatism that might flow through different forms of discrimination. I don't think are essential to any religion, but the interpretations of some religions I saw led people that way to, homophobia and sexism and anti-Semitism and so on. So there were ethical and evidence reasons why I just, decided I'm not going to be a Christian anymore. I became an atheist or an agnostic, extreme agnostic, you might say. But atheism or agnosticism doesn't really say anything about ethics or, what to do in the world. It's just the lack of a belief in something, which isn't particularly useful, really. So then I layered on, I guess, what more broadly is a naturalistic approach, which isn't just, I don't happen to believe in God. It just says more positively, I'm going to try and hold credence in things and beliefs based on evidence and reason as far as I can work those things out. So that was a more positive way of saying, instead of, I just don't believe in it, in this thing, here's how I'm going to choose to believe. But then I moved to humanism for the positive ethical side as well, because humanism in simple terms says we'll have a naturalistic way of understanding the world. We don't need a religion or the supernatural or a deity to tell us what's right and what's wrong. Our sense of what's right and wrong comes from a universal compassion for all humans. All humans matter, regardless of sex, race, gender, sexual preference, characteristic, history, whatever. All humans matter. So that felt like it was taking this sort of naturalistic facts and evidence thing, but then layering on a compassionate ethic. But the problem there, I guess, is partly in the name, is that there's an implication, and this isn't true for all humanists. Many humanists, like most humans, also do have compassion that goes beyond the human. But by definition, it is quite anthropocentric. It's quite focused on human beings and human definitions of right and wrong. And most humanists today do pretty much restrict their compassion to other humans. So that seemed like a problem to me. So in essence, I was looking for something that would keep the naturalism, keep the universal compassion, but extend that compassion out to any being that has the capacity to suffer. So that was how I got to it. I've been rambling on too long now, but yeah, hopefully that adds some color.
That's great. And partly what I want to do here. So I have lots of questions and lots, and sort of, following. Like, one of the things I'm trying not to worry about is that you're like, way more than I do. So my questions and objections are going to seem very puerile and easily knocked down. But it seems like there's two parts to talk about. But there's the evidence and reason, and then there's the compassion. Let's start with the compassion, because that's easier for me, and I think it'll be easier for the listeners. Many of whom I know are deeply religious and may be already triggered by the conversation. So you mentioned the term sentientism is from 1971. So I'm imagining that's sort of like Peter Singer, animal liberation time.
Yeah. So there's two ways of answering this. You're right. That was when the term was first used. It was first used in a couple of weird contexts, actually. It was used by one academic. I won't go into the details behind it, but it was a very strange use of the term that didn't seem enormously relevant. But then it was mainly used by a chap first used in, I think, a proper context by a chap called John Rodman in 1977, actually to criticize Singer and Richard Ryder and some of the other people in the Oxford group, the Godloviches and others who were talking about animal advocacy and sentience as this moral qualifier, and in essence echoing what Jeremy Bentham said way back in 1789, I think, where he said, look, the question is, can they suffer? Which is one way of saying, are they sentient? That's almost the same question. So you're right, the Godloviches and Singer and Ryder and the Oxford group and various others were talking about this idea of granting moral consideration to all sentient beings. And John Rodman actually coined the term, I think, sentientism, to criticize it. And he was saying, look, this is just another form of discrimination, because you're discriminating against entities that aren't sentient and that can't suffer. And to a degree, Richard Ryder and others then picked the term up and said, yes, that is exactly what we're saying. We're saying we should have moral consideration and compassion for all sentient beings. And yes, we are discriminating against non-sentient entities, and they don't care because they can't experience anything. So that is, if you like, the only moral discrimination. That's the place to try and draw this fuzzy line to say, we should care about every being that has a perspective, that can suffer, that has an experience. And beyond that, we might still care, but that would be instrumental. But again, there's always a temptation in these conversations to sort of go back to, the Oxford group, or go back to Bentham, go back to Enlightenment ideas. But the roots of this sentientism concept, or another long word people might have come across, is sentiocentrism, which is basically this, granting moral consideration based on sentience. That's one half of sentientism, has really deep ancient roots in so many different cultures, religious and not. So again, if you look back into elements of Rastafarian culture or various indigenous cultures, you look at the idea of ahimsa, that obviously is common to many of the Eastern-centric religions. You can already find these ideas here. The idea of not harming was explicitly applied to non-humans. It wasn't just a human concept. So I think this idea about caring about non-humans has deep ancient roots as well, even though it might have been formalized and some of these words invented more recently.
Right. So I've interviewed folks around, like indigenous thinking lately, and in particular, an Australian academic and indigenous person, Tyson Yunkaporta, who's written an amazing book, Sand Talk, and he's really convinced me that we really need to pay a lot of attention to indigenous thinking, because it just has a track record. Like, if you're just talking about evidence and reason, there's a lot of reason to think that all our modern brilliance is leading us down some very strange paths. So let's privilege stuff that works. But he talks about also compassion for rocks, or at least attention. And so is there was something in listening to your interview with was it Massimo Pugliucci?
Yes, yeah.
That it felt a little bit sort of binary.
Yeah.
to me. Like we have, there's a line somewhere. So like, are trees sentient? Is soil sentient? Are microbes sentient? Is the minerals that then become my body, like when do they become sentient? Is that just nitpicking, or is there something important there in that sort of critique?
No, I think there's something important there. And one thing about this sentientism idea is it doesn't tell us which things are sentient. It doesn't have a list of species or entities either. It just says, follow the science with humility and, use the evidence we can find. Now, so different sentientists will disagree about where to draw that line. Now, my personal view is, I think, roughly in line with scientific consensus, that it seems that, certainly humans, mammals, birds, reptiles, basically all of the invertebrates, we have strong evidence they seem to be sentient. And there's increasing understanding, even in the invertebrate world, with insects, decapods, cephalopods like the octopus, that they are also sentient as well. With some of the simpler invertebrates, it's less clear. And my personal view is that there probably is a fuzzy boundary where, we might legalistically decide to draw a line, but that isn't how reality works. I think there probably are fuzzy boundaries, both in reality and in our ability to have knowledge of them, that mean, it's a tricky barrier to draw. But to jump to the flip side of that question, as you were asking about, okay, what about trees and plants and rocks and rivers and other aspects of the ecosystem? Again, I'd take quite a strong line in that I haven't seen any convincing evidence that trees, rocks, rivers, anything outside of the animal kingdom is likely to have sentience. I'm not 100% sure they don't, but I just have very low credence because I haven't seen the evidence. And that's really based on, I guess, 3 lines of inference. This isn't about perfect knowledge. This isn't about yes or no. This is just building evidence. And those lines really are about, the evolutionary history we share with animals and the drivers, including the need to move around our environment, that seem to have driven our capacity for sentience. There's our, I guess, behavior and communications. And while plants do show an enormous richness of communications, we're learning more about that all the time, particularly with, the fungal networks and how trees communicate and so on. It has a different character to what we see in the animal kingdom. And then in the anatomy and just the physical information processing that's going on when we experience our own consciousness doesn't seem to have any analog in the plant kingdom, and certainly not in rocks or anywhere else. So that's my personal view. But at the same time, there are others, and I've interviewed a couple of them, who have a radically different view. So I talked to a guy called Luke Roelofs, who's an amazing, thoughtful philosopher who subscribes to panpsychism. And in a sense, he says, yes, maybe there's a fuzzy boundary for sentience and consciousness, but he thinks that means it never really stops. So in a sense, almost everything has some minimal level of consciousness and sentience within it, even down to the level of elementary particles. So I don't agree with that view. Others do. So that's a long answer to where is this sentience boundary, and there are open questions there. But there's a second question that you're asking, I think, which is, one is, how do we ascribe sentience and where do we draw the line there? But there's a second question, which is, okay, even if we are confident that plants aren't sentient, shouldn't they matter anyway? Shouldn't they matter even if they're not sentient, even if they can't experience, they can't suffer? And I think most sentientists would agree that they do, but it's in a different way. So for me, the environment, the ecosystem we all share is absolutely critically important. I care about it richly and deeply in a moral way because of its criticality to all of the sentient beings that we share the planet with. That's why I care about rocks and rivers and plants and ecosystems and Gaia as a system. But I don't care about them intrinsically. That's why the Earth matters more to me than a distant planet in a different solar system with no life on it or around it. To me, that is an interesting ecosystem intellectually, but it doesn't have any moral worth because there's no sentient being that can suffer or flourish. So that, again, a too long answer, but hopefully that's given you a sense of where the fuzzy boundaries around sentientism might lie and the differences of opinion about the nature of it. Right. But also the fact that you can still care about non-sentient things in a deep way. It's just an instrumental second order morality rather than.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to hear that you're open to consideration of other perspectives, because from my perspective, it's almost like, I kind of like the Gaia hypothesis. Like there's this, like when you look at the Earth and the amazing planet we live on that we haven't yet managed to destroy, like to think that it has a consciousness, and that so we're like two cells in the right pinky arguing about whether the body has consciousness or just the cells.
And I think there's a lot to like about that systemic, holistic way of thinking. Everything is connected. It's a system that runs. I don't think the Earth is conscious. I don't think it experiences anything. To be honest, I think the Earth as a system, if all humans got wiped out and all life got wiped out, it would still continue to run physically and operate. I think it's essentially amoral and non-conscious. But either way, I think we can still share a strong overlap in our caring about the planet and the environment, even if it's for slightly different reasons. And I guess the one area where I do get nervous, and I don't think your audience, given its nature, will fall into this trap, but there are some people who they'll go from an anthropocentric concern for humans, right? We care about the whole human species. That's great, a good start. And then they will jump, particularly in the context of climate change and this environmental crisis, to a very expansive moral consideration for, Gaia, for the entire planet, for all of the ecosystems, for the rocks and rivers, for the plants that we share this planet with as well, which feels very generous. And technically that might be called a biocentrism, would include all plants, and then ecocentrism would be even broader than that and think about the moral value of all ecosystems. But too many people who do that, which I think is a generous positive step, too many people who do that still conveniently carve out vast numbers of very obviously sentient animals from their moral consideration. So we see this. I think this is the central gravity of the modern environmental movement. You almost get to the point where people are more willing to ascribe rights to rivers than they are to a pig in a factory farm. And so in a sense, sentientism is saying you can go beyond sentience if you like, right? That's fine if you want to, but please don't forget any of the sentient beings. Every single sentient being has to matter morally. You have to take that seriously. Even if you want to care about rocks and rivers and trees, that's fine, but please also care about farmed and wild and liminal animals too. And I'd argue that even if you do, care about plants directly morally, there is still something distinctively different about the capacity to suffer. That means for me, cutting a carrot is a morally different act from cutting a pig, for example.
Yeah.
So again, that's too much of a rant, but I think there are some risks in going too far if we forget the sentient beings. So that's my main thing: is just don't forget the sentient beings.
Right. Okay. That's beautiful, because every vegan, I think, has had that philosophical challenge to them. Is like, why do you hate plants so much?
Yeah.
Right. Like, the lettuce is suffering too, and right.
And in a way, that's a danger of this, biocentric or ecocentric way of thinking, because you're almost playing into that and saying, look, a tree should have rights as well. And they'll say, well, then cutting down a tree is the same as cutting the throat of a pig. And I think even if you do care about trees, there's still something different about this capacity to suffer that should, raise sentient beings up another level. And again, I've had a couple of frustrating conversations in my podcast with people who've said, they have this rich, deep, ecocentric concern for the environment. And they will say, nature is wonderful. Everything is connected. Life is life. Cycles and patterns continue as they have for millennia. As part of those patterns, life consumes life. Humans are part of life. We must also consume life. So pass me a bacon sandwich and some chicken nuggets.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you've gone from this super generous moral scope where you richly care about everything, but then you use this sort of nature, the circle of life, I'm just playing my part to give you an excuse to continue to needlessly harm sentient beings. So there's just some traps in that expansive ways of thinking we need to watch out for. We need to focus on making sure that those sentient beings get protected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And and I've had discussions with podcast guests around hunting, which I can't categorically disapprove of, compared to factory farming. And especially when I talk about, sort of indigenous cultures,
Yeah.
And the way things were, and life does consume life, and all the truisms there. It seems to be just that a lot of that is.
And I share some of that sympathy, but there's a danger there again, because if you listen to the arguments from the people who run factory farms in the US, right, massive ranches, or the people who've been driving the deforestation in Brazil, they will actually use the same arguments. They will say, this is our way of life, it's our tradition, it's a natural part of the process, and it's like, well, when you think about it from the perspective of the victim, none of that really helps, right? Whether you're doing it for traditional reasons or whatever the motivation of the human is.
Yeah.
When you think about it from the victim's perspective, it doesn't make a difference. But at the same time, if someone's in a survival situation, or in a situation where they just have different alternatives, absolutely, that's a radically different situation from the people who buy from factory farms. So the context can make a difference. But again, I think we need to always just check ourselves and think from the perspective of the victim and play that into the story as well, whatever that story is.
Right. Well, there's ways in which systems thinking can elide the individual value of the pig but there's also ways in which not thinking systemically, like there are plenty of vegans who are very happy to eat sugar which was grown on plantations on deforested land, that that monoculture vegan agriculture is arguably destroying habitat. Well, it's not actually taking a bolt to the brain of a cow, but it's still leading to, I think we need both the reductionist and the holistic view together to live responsibly in this complex world.
I completely agree. I mean, and I think those different perspectives can help us come to a more rounded view. I'd certainly agree that this sort of idea that being vegan means you've achieved some sort of moral perfection is just absolutely insane, right? There's no basis to that whatsoever. We're trying to do better in a fairly obvious way, but that doesn't mean the end of the story in terms of trying to make the world a better place, or live by causing less suffering. And I agree that systemic way of thinking has puts a very different lens on problems and can really help us see a different way through. At the same time, I think you're right. The more individualistic perspective is useful because it is the individuals that really experience the suffering. And as long as we're playing that into the calculus as we think these through, we'll have a better chance of taking better decisions.
Yeah. Well, there's also, I think, a PR consideration. So, when we were emailing, I was trying to decide if I was a sentientist or not. And I think what I've come up with is that I'm sentientist friendly, but right now I'm more of a contextualist. Like, does it work? And there's something about humanism and sentientism that feels like it's hard for humans to kind of get behind, as opposed to here's the picture of the beached whale, here's the picture of the starving child. Like, this is going to get us to take action and be we need stories that make sense to our ancient brains. I was just reading a piece by Yuval Noah Harari in the New York Times talking about climate change, and his point is that none of the facts are going to move us because it's not a good story. So a good story is Greta Thunberg saying the old are sacrificing the young. Oh yeah, we get that one.
There's a narrative. I've heard that before. Yeah.
The narrative, right? Yeah. So is there a narrative behind sentientism, or are we just asking people to be more philosophical than they can be?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a narrative behind it. It doesn't have a story within it, really. But I think it can enable many stories, including, Greta Thunberg and Yuval Noah Harari, who, interestingly, I think both are suspected sentientists. And, both of them have a naturalistic way of thinking. They use evidence and reason. Neither of them have a supernatural worldview. And both of them are vegan, which is normally a good indicator that you care about sentient beings. So I totally agree. And I think that there is a danger, we'll come on to the sort of naturalistic side of this thing in a bit, that it can feel quite cold and clinical and scientific and, all a bit dull and locked down and everything's in a spreadsheet. And that's not the implication. We can come to this compassion thing both through rationality and thought and philosophy, but we can also come to it, emotionally, or through stories or through narratives or through look into the eyes of a puppy, or, there's many different ways to come to that compassion, and many ways to then build interesting stories on top of it to make it compelling. And in a way, the sentientism idea, it's interesting to think about the opposite, because the first choice is, do you have compassion for all sentient beings or not? And if you don't, there are essentially some beings that are capable of suffering that you don't think count morally. So that's the opposite. The opposite, or the flip side, is saying there are some classes of sentient beings that I do not think count morally. So that's the opposition. And then on the naturalism side, the simplest opposition is supernaturalism, which I guess means forming beliefs, that aren't grounded in evidence or reasoning. So, that might be an interesting way of putting the counterpoint. There's almost those two major ways of disagreeing with sentientism. You either exclude some sentient beings from our compassion, or you ground your beliefs in something that isn't evidence and reasoning.
Yeah. See, I mean, let's stick with the compassion for just another couple of minutes. I don't know anybody who wouldn't call themselves a sentientist on that basis.
Yeah.
But it's like something happens on the way from the mouth to the stomach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it feels much more like this incredible blind spot.
Yeah.
Around where people are simply, it's not that they have a coherent worldview that says that eating factory farmed animals is okay. It's that they have a coherent worldview and they are in such utter denial that if you touch them with sentientism, it's like, they have no skin, and it's just, it's just hitting raw nerves, and there's no conversation to be had.
Yeah. And in a way, I think that's the central challenge, because it's a frustrating message in a way, because the social norms and the indoctrination are so powerful and so pervasive. It feels very difficult working against those. But the positive side of it is that the raw materials are already there. As you say, most people just intuitively and obviously feel a compassion that goes beyond the human species already. The way most people will feel about their companion animals as a great example. So I'm never quite sure whether to take that, good news, bad news. But I do agree, because many people, will hear about the basics of sentientism and they'll agree in concept. And then you say, well, this is what it means in practice. And then things fall apart, because they've actually, while they might theoretically agree with having a compassion for all sentient beings in concept, they've had parts of that blocked by these social norms and by these habits and by these traditions that have led them very far astray. And there are some people who will say, and you will hear the common sense version of this as a vegan on Twitter every day, right? No, I do care about animals, but I still eat them. But when you play that through in simple terms, it's clear those things aren't consistent. If I have compassion for you, but it still enables me to, have you harmed and killed for trivial pleasures, that's not a moral consideration or a compassion worth having, right? That is, in practical terms, zero moral consideration. I don't, if you were to think that way about another human being, but to say, no, I care about them, but I did these things to them.
Well, we do that as well.
Logical sense. Well, there's a degree of that. But not quite in the same. In a way, it feels with non-human animals so much starker and more direct. In the industrialization and the commission of the acts and the consumption of the beings we're talking about. But I agree, you can apply it through to the human world too, and say, well, it's nice that you say we should have universal human rights, but what about X, Y, and Z? And I think that's part of you might say, well, what's the point of having a worldview if people have it in concept but don't apply it into practice? But I think it helps us work on the practice if we can be really clear about this worldview, because it is something we can hold up and challenge people in their behaviors against, and say, well, you say this, but here are the implications. And maybe the clarity of that stance, is a useful lever as we work to break down these social norms that get in the way of our compassion.
Yeah. I'm suddenly remembering a wonderful scene in Douglas Adams' book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe.
Awesome.
I figured you were a fan of his.
Yes.
Where the scene is that they're sitting, I can't remember who's sitting at the table ready to order, and the waiter comes over, and the waiter is a cow, a talking cow, who's describing the various cuts of meat that they can order off of this cow who's about to be killed for their food, and they're horrified. Like, because this is a sentient being in connection with them in this moment, and it's like, but I want to die. Would you rather? Would you rather kill some cow who doesn't?
Yeah,
it kind of shook me a little bit. I think it was well before I was a vegetarian or vegan. Like, there's something going on there.
And that's one of the weird things in that it's so easy to tap into the acrasia or the cognitive dissonance or just the denial.
What was that word?
So cognitive dissonance.
Acrasia.
Yeah. So acrasia, as I understand it, is like the next level beyond cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance is believing, two incompatible things and the psychological distress that might come from that. Acrasia, as I understand it, is the next step beyond, where, for example, you might know that even in terms of your own morality, animal product consumption is wrong, but you just do it anyway. So it's almost like another level of disconnection between your own moral, rational thinking and your behavior. And I think many people are in that mode. And then denial is obviously another level where you just, like I did for many decades, just deliberately avoid thinking about the topic because you have this sense of where it will lead you and you don't want to go there.
So acrasia is me still ordering from Amazon after completely disapproving of their labor practices.
That could maybe that's another good example. Yeah.
Oh, slimy.
Yeah. But we're and again, a positive framing on this in a way is that it feels like when it comes to the animal product world and animal ethics, in a way, it almost feels like technically and morally we've won the argument already. There are no real pushbacks, and just as time goes on, we have more and more arguments on our side about climate, environment, and zoonotic disease and antimicrobial resistance and so on. It's almost as if the technical argument has been won. It's over. It's done. Now, all we have to do, and this is a silly thing to say because this is the big problem, it's about those social norms.
Which is where I guess the fake meats and the cultured cells can come in. It's like, okay, well, if people can be just as happy doing the right thing, like if anti-Amazon.com showed up and they were just as convenient and they treated their workers well, and I'd be like, yeah, cool, I can keep doing what I'm doing.
And I think that's it, right? And then you get into the very, very difficult space, and there's some brilliant academics doing work about how to, which levers to pull and how. And you and I have interviewed some of them. Because I think, moral argument does work, but it doesn't work very fast and it doesn't work with very many people. Your guests and my guests on our podcast are probably pretty weird outliers, and that most of them have, listened to moral arguments, thought things through and been willing to make changes, even at risk of, some, social challenges. But we know it's, slow and painful generally just to use moral argument, although that you can reach tipping points where things can change remarkably quickly. But it does then feed into this other way of thinking of, look, how can we make it fast, cheap and easy for people to do the right thing? And then maybe when they're doing more of the right thing, that will free them because they will no longer be implicated. It will free them to actually bring their ethics to where they already were. Maybe there we can see some really rapid changes.
Yeah. So one of the things I think about is like, what's the root of like the human dysfunction, the human ethical dysfunction. And depending on who I'm reading on a given day, it could be capitalism, it could be kind of the narcissism of Western civilization in general, it could be religion, it could be just, we're doing fine, we're just going through this phase. Like I read a philosopher, eco-philosopher named Bill Plotkin, who has been talking about like the current crisis, like humans are basically the imaginal cells of the, like we could be amazing or we could be like really interesting crapshoot, like for nature to create humans.
Yeah, absolutely. Who knows where this will go? Yeah.
I'm not sure what my question is there, but like what's your thought about like, well, I think where do we go wrong?
Well, I think we can in a way you can blame evolution for a lot of this stuff because if you go back to where we began and you can look back even to pre-human evolution, I think it's given us a lot of our problems. It's given us our tribalism. It's given us our maybe our defensiveness. It's given us some paranoia. It's given us the motivation to detect agency where maybe there isn't any agency. It's given us our aggression. It's given our, competitive urges, which can have negative downsides as well. So you can see where, that came from, because ultimately we are just another pretty weird type of, mammalian ape. So, but at the same time, it's also given us, and arguably many non-human animals, the seeds of the good stuff as well, right? So, humans didn't invent compassion. I think mothers have felt compassion for their children, and family members have felt compassion for many, many hundreds of millions of years before humans came on the scene, and non-human animals feel those things too. So I think in this sense of, an intuitive compassion that we've then maybe intellectualized, but also this pattern of behaviors that recognize the value of cooperation. And that might be, just in an adaptive sense, termites building a mound together, or ants leaving trails of pheromones to lead each other to food. That can feel quite technical and practical, just help them survive. But again, it's something that we've picked up as part of our evolutionary legacy. And, we've built on it to an incredible extent. So I think we've got both the good and the bad, built into us. And in a way, I guess the human condition is using these weird intellectual capabilities we've, developed out of reasons that were really driven through our ability to, survive roaming the savannah, to then, use that intellect to try and tip the tide in the battle between good and evil. And in a sense, we've got to the point now where we are still, just by definition, still part of biological evolution. Like, there's no way of escaping that. Everything around us is an extended phenotype, if you like. The laptop here, in a sense, is like the termite mound. So we're still part of that system. There's no way of escaping it. But at the same time, we've developed a capacity where we can just decide that gene propagation is not what we're going to focus on anymore. So we're almost betraying, our genetic evolution, and just deciding that other things matter. My own experience, my own suffering, your suffering, the suffering of other sentient beings. So yeah, that's, I don't want to ramble on too long, but I think we've been given both the good and the bad, and we're now using our intellect and our rationality imperfectly to, decide what we want to do next. And as to the future, I do remain reasonably optimistic about where we'll get to long term, as long as we give ourselves the chance to get to the long term.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, it's interesting to think, the image is coming to me is sort of, we're like, teetering. We have both, like angel and devil on the shoulders. Like, we have both of these proclivities, the tribalism to kind of be suspicious and hate anyone who doesn't look like us, which is wrapped up in our love of those in our tribe. It's, from my perspective, a lot of sort of, global late stage capitalism is really pushing us in the awful directions, in that, like, just in terms of like the neurophysiology of stress, when you feel competitive, when you feel like there is a lack, you're going to be much more hyper competitive, hyper aggressive, tunnel focused on what you need. And we live in a society, from advertising to social inequality to economic inequality, where many of us just feel that lack pressing down on us on a daily basis. I'm wondering if that's sort of, skewing the odds of us being sentientists, as opposed to just being, greedy, stressed out apes.
Yeah, egoistic and self-centered. And it may do. There's certainly a risk there. And one of the interesting things about this sort of sentientist way of thinking is that people who ascribe to it seem to cover the entire socio-political and economic map as well. So I think all of them are socially liberal, because by definition, if you have compassion for all sentient beings, there's no space for negative discriminations in there. But when it comes to economic models or political models, it's been really interesting to find there are people who are fairly neoliberal on capitalism and think that we might be able to shift it to embed more compassionate values because humans have compassion, so why not express that through capitalism? Others think we need some radically different system. Others take a more communal, socialistic or communistic approach. Others are anarchist. So, that's an aside really, but people differ radically in their views about what's the best economic and political system to try and make the world better for all sentient beings. But put that to one side, I think capitalism is a fascinating example, because on the one hand, it's almost the most extreme version of cooperation you can imagine, because the number of people that needed to work together to get me this laptop, or to get us the Zoom technology we're using to talk on, is an incredible form of cooperation of various different supposedly self-interested humans to, deliver something that you and I value. So there's something positive about that. There's also something positive in the capitalist ideal about, freedom. I can choose what I want and I can produce what I want, and things will play out, and I'll be rewarded in terms of the value I deliver to others, which might sound like it has the element of compassion in. I get rewarded if I'm helping others. But of course, that's not what much of late stage capitalism feels like. It feels like a status game. It feels like there are concentrations of power in unhealthy ways. It feels like there are corporations that are motivated not to, make us happy and comfortable, but if we get too comfortable, to give us new latent needs that we didn't even know we had that make us feel unsatisfied, so we'll buy more. So yeah, again, it's this really weird situation where you can see some sort of positive elements about cooperation and sharing and freedom and helping and doing things together, and then some warping that takes us off track and leads us to egoism and status anxiety and consumerism and extractive industries and destruction of the environment. And yeah, so I don't, it's hard. I don't have an easy answer.
I mean, it seems like one of the countervailing forces against this extremely destructive egoism is the sentientist idea of compassion for all beings who can feel and sense. That it's, that in a sense, when I'm really wrapped up in my egoism and it's just like me for myself, not only am I not a sentientist, I don't even care about you. I don't even care about my neighbor. The worse it gets, like I'd sacrifice anybody to get mine.
Yeah, I agree. And it's there are different ways of talking about this, universal compassion for all sentient beings. You can take a sort of rational approach and say, well, you already have compassion for X, Y, and Z sentient beings. What's your logical reason for constraining your compassion for all the others? And if there isn't one, then you should care about them all. You can say, it will feel better to have this type of ethic because it's generous and rich and, has a logical basis. You can say it will be better for you, even selfishly, it will be better for you to have this ethic because cooperation is good for you. And even though you might not see how, you can cooperate with all those other sentient beings, ultimately in long causal chains, it will be better for you and the people around you if we take this compassionate approach, partly because, we enjoy living in a world where the others around us are more compassionate. So there's a bunch of ways you can, sort of argue people towards it. But in a sense, morality might just be a choice, right? If you decide to only care about Howard, there will be consequences of that, hopefully, in the wider society. But, there's no objective external authority I can appeal to tell you you're wrong. So, but I agree. I think that's one thing I do say to, I talk to people who, either think we can make a more compassionate capitalism or we need a socialistic or even a communistic approach or an anarchist approach, which ultimately is where Marxism is supposed to end up once you've gone through the revolutionary stages, of course. But I guess my message to them is whatever political or economic system you favor, it's more likely to work better for the world if people believe things that are well tuned to reality through evidence and reason, and if people have a more compassionate way of thinking. Because if all of the people participating in capitalism had a sentientist ethic, there would be no animal farming, for example. And if everybody in a communist mode had a sentientist ethic, you wouldn't have the oppression that often comes out of the attempt to enforce communism, because the compassion there is a safety mechanism. So again, my argument to whatever people's political and economic philosophy is, it will work better if we have a sentientist ethic and a worldview sitting behind it.
Yeah. So we're almost at an hour, and I haven't even begun to the first half, which is about evidence and reason. So I'm a little reluctant to kind of just dip my toe in the water there. Maybe we'll save that for when I'm on your podcast, and we can hash that out. But I'm just sort of curious about if the world is in many ways dire straits, and sentientism could help. Do you feel like the big problem is a deficit of extended compassion, or a deficit of regard for evidence and reason?
Yeah, well, I do think it's both. I think if you force me to pick, I would go for the sentiocentrism. I would go for the compassion. But I do think it's both. And that's why I've bundled the two together into this idea, in the same way as humanism has done the same thing. And yeah, we can delve into it a bit more when you come on my podcast. That'd be great if your audience can come and join us there. But in simple terms, there's a few reasons why I think this naturalism thing, this evidence and reason commitment, is also important. One is that I just think we're more likely to be right in our understanding of the world, or more accurate, if we use evidence from reality to understand reality. So whatever we want to do, whatever our value systems, I think the more accurate our understanding and our beliefs are, the more effective we'll be in the world in trying to make it better. And I think anything that isn't grounded in evidence is just more likely to be wrong. So that's, I guess, one reason. That's like a practical reason why I think naturalism is a good way about doing things. I think the other thing is that even for people who are richly and deeply and generously compassionate, there can be risks of those generous ethics being warped under some types of supernatural thinking. Certainly not always the case. Some supernatural beliefs can be beneficial. Some are just irrelevant and interesting. Some are fun. Some are curious, but don't have an impact on our ethics. But all too often, supernatural worldviews seem to warp otherwise compassionate ethics. And that can either be because the universal compassion is then made conditional or constrained. So you might find that, for example, in some religious worldviews where they will say, if you're in the tent and you've been saved by Jesus, you will go to heaven. Anyone outside of that, even people who've never had the chance to hear the word of the Lord, will go and burn for a hell in eternity. And I think that's a warping of a compassionate ethics in a pretty radical way. So there's an in-group, out-group thing that can sometimes warp this universal compassion. But there's often a conditional compassion as well. So instead of it being universal, it's, well, you'll get to keep my compassion, but only if you follow these rules. And you follow them in the way that I've laid out. And those rules were probably written down a couple of thousand years ago by a man in a very different time. So there's that conditionality and constraint on universal compassion that I think can sometimes flow from a supernatural worldview. There can sometimes be arbitrary rules which were set in a different time that I don't think fit today. I don't think following the words of Leviticus or some of the sections of the Quran are great ways of guiding our sex lives or what we wear or what we eat today, and cause many harm to people outside of those communities and within them. And I think the final thing I'd say, which is a risk, is that when we move away from a naturalistic worldview that says, we should just care about sentient beings, quite often in a supernatural worldview, something else is put as more important than the sentient beings. That doesn't have to be religious, that could be a national leader, or it could be blood and soil, it could be a nation state, or it could be a cult leader, or it could be a god, or it could be the church or the church institution. And as soon as those things become to be seen as more important than the suffering and death of sentient beings, you tend to get suffering and death of sentient beings. And the classic example that I've used a couple of times before is, that one of Abraham and Isaac, where God says to Abraham, as a test of his faith, I want you to kill your own son. And Abraham felt compassion for Isaac. I'm sure he loved him, right? So the compassion was absolutely there. But the supernatural ethic was, one thing is more important than your compassion, and that is your obedience to me, even if I tell you to do something that has no compassion in it. So that's a sort of, hopefully, an intro to why I don't think all supernatural beliefs systems are harmful by any means. Many of them have rich veins of compassion within them, but I'm just nervous of some of those dangers. Whereas if we stick to a naturalistic approach, I think we're less likely to bump into them.
Gotcha. I just want to say that growing up Jewish and studying the not just the text of the Bible, but also the rabbinic arguments over it over hundreds of years. There's a strong vein that says that Abraham failed that test.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So the real test was one of compassion.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that actually. Yeah. Oh, well, I like that interpretation. I'm going to go with that one.
Yeah. So let's end with getting your thoughts on this, which is something that shocked me over the last few years in the plant-based, vegan, natural health movement.
Yeah.
is that people have gone crazy.
Yes.
Right. And at first it just seemed like, what the hell is going on? This is an anomaly. And then later it started to seem like some of my beliefs or the community that I live in is part of a slippery slope. So if I'm plant-based, and I've been plant-based for 30 years, and the world is never caught up,
yeah,
and there's so much evidence for the benefits, the health benefits, the environmental benefits, the ecological, everything, and yet all the doctors around me are saying you should eat meat, and then I start to think, well, there's some conspiracy out there, or I know more than other people.
Yeah.
And then if I'm doing yoga and everyone else around me is walking around with bad backs, and I've got this, and I'm doing Ayurveda and I'm getting massages, and then all of a sudden I'm supporting QAnon and Trumpist neo-fascism, and I'm part of this community that's been saying, see, you can't trust the mainstream media.
Yeah.
And I know this is going to get into kind of that whole idea of evidence and reason. And I just will say, like, there have been a few times in my life where I have been involved in stories that were reported in the news, and the news every single time got it completely wrong.
Yeah.
Which leads me to sort of question, like, where do I get my evidence? Like, what's your sense? I mean, you're sort of, I don't know how deeply connected you are to sort of the vegan community or plant-based or alternative health, but what's your sense of, like, how we've shit the bed on this?
Beautifully, but I think this is another point. This is another reason why I'm so committed to this naturalism side, because when we come back to the veganism world and the animal advocacy world, it's an important part of maintaining our credibility as a movement, because we're already targets for, thinking in this sort of woo way, thinking that veganism cures cancer, thinking that, there's that sort of sense around parts of the community. That's one of the reasons we're challenged. So I think it's important for us to almost double down on a naturalistic approach to make sure that when we are making claims about environmental impact of plant-based, or the health claims of plant-based, or whatever it is, that we are grounding those with humility in actual evidence. And I think you're right. It's also difficult because as part of, a minority group that is absolutely convinced we're right about the ethics of animal farming and fishing, for example, it seems so obvious to us, but we're in a tiny minority. It leads you into thinking there must be some conspiracy going on. How can everybody else disagree with me? So I can see the temptation of people moving into some of those modes of thinking where you just say, well, I don't trust institutions or the press or journalism or industry or government on this topic, which is very important to me. So I'm going to throw the whole lot out and start turning to sources that frankly don't even pretend to have any evidence at all. Now, I don't think there is a perfect answer to this, because there's no perfection in naturalism at all. It's just setting credences based on evidence that is always imperfect and always changing. But I think it is about having the appropriate level of skepticism. And that means we can be skeptical of scientific thinking in the press and journalism and mainstream institutions, but it also means we just don't burn them to the ground and start making stuff up either. And I think quite often when we do think through in a reasonably balanced way, we can find our way to making robust, clear, positive claims that are well supported by scientific evidence about the health impact of plant-based, which I think is strengthening by the month. I think the evidence base about the climate and environmental impacts of a plant-based lifestyle and a just transition away from animal agriculture. Again, the evidence is strong and powerful and growing by the month. We don't need to overplay our hand. And when you go into some of the more outlandish things you talked about, whether it's QAnon or anti-vax or various conspiracy theories or flat earthers, when you see a story that feels, going back to your Yuval Noah Harari thing, right, where you come across a narrative that just feels too convincing because it has all the answers, but when you dig under the surface, there's actually no evidence there at all. We've just got to be ready to watch out for those things, because this pattern of an understandable distrust of institutions and sort of mainstream stuff, and therefore I'm going to completely jump the shark and start believing reassuring stories that have no foundation whatsoever in reality, is, to go from one awful extreme to the other. And I think there is a middle road where we can improve and shape and change institutions by pulling them back to an evidence base.
Yeah, one of the things that's not endeared me when I've been on other people's podcasts or they've been on mine, and they're sort of the ethical vegans, is that I will say that I am not sure that veganism is the best ethical path there is. Mm-hmm. Like I follow it, and I'm pretty sure, but I can't defend it to the death. Like, and it seems like this sort of form of like Socratic humility is very important to this to the practice of sentientism. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it does. And I think sometimes the sort of scientific community, and particularly non-religious people, atheists, can sometimes come across as being really sharp-edged and harsh and overconfident. They're almost dogmatic in the same way as they might criticize the religious, right? But the real heart of naturalism is humility and open-mindedness, and always looking at different hypotheses and different sets of evidence, being skeptical of all of them and balancing all of them. It's not about saying, I've done the spreadsheet, here is the answer, now I'm stopping listening, right? That's not what naturalism is. So we need to have this sort of epistemological humility and openness, and recognize that we are, apes wandering the savannah, right? What gives us the right to have perfect knowledge? We're outside of maths or formal systems. We're just not going to have it, right? We're just going to have different degrees of confidence. So our beliefs should be provisional, probabilistic, and where they have an ethical impact, prudent. So I think that humility is important there. But I think you're right. We should have that humility and pluralism on the ethical side as well, right? What gives us the confidence that a list of deontological rules or a virtue ethic or a care ethic is exactly the right thing in all circumstances? Shouldn't we be open-minded about our morals as well? So yeah, I'd agree that sort of humility on both the ethical side and the facts and reason side are deeply important.
Right. And one of the things I really appreciate from listening to you is your unwillingness to call other people names.
And not yet. I might get snarky on Twitter occasionally when I lose control, but
yeah. Right. But that's was it Acrasia or
yeah, exactly. I just can't help myself. Yeah. But I think that's an important part of this universally compassionate idea that I think you're right. Many vegans forget too, understandably, because universal compassion means universal compassion, right? And that's not just for farmed animals. That means for wild and liminal sentient animals as well, which can be a tricky topic for many animal advocates and vegans. But it also means
what do you mean by that? Wild and liminal?
So wild animals just living in the wild in nature, outside of human spaces largely, and liminal animals are the ones that are sort of in between, that they're wild but live in and around human spaces. So you might think of rats in a city or pigeons. Those sorts of things. So in a sense, sentientism is saying, this isn't just about animal farming. This is about having moral consideration for all of those other sentient, non-human animals as well. And if you want to get sci-fi, at least maybe be open-minded about artificial intelligence as well. But that's a topic for a different day. But it's also about universal compassion for all human beings, and that isn't just universal compassion for human beings that we agree with. That is compassion for people we disagree with, that we have fundamental differences of opinion about, even for other humans that cause harm. And compassion doesn't mean appeasement or weakness. It doesn't mean we don't intervene, we don't constrain, we don't punish, but it does mean that you should have compassion even for humans we disagree with. And maybe that's the toughest thing. And for ourselves too, which we too often forget.
Yeah, and especially if you want to, be a contextualist like me and say, like, what we want is things that work.
Yeah.
Like, we don't shame people. Like, I don't think PETA shames fur wearers into not wearing furs.
Yeah.
Into becoming animal advocates. It can drive it underground, maybe.
Yeah.
But
we're not. And it's difficult because I do have sympathy for it, because I think once, if you like, the blinkers have been taken off around something like fur farming or animal farming generally, the horror is so egregious and so direct and so visceral and obvious that of course it's natural to be outraged and to preach and to challenge, even attack. I mean, it's understandable, right? And that's sort of what you do if it was a topic in human ethics. If you woke up one morning and in the time of slavery, and you suddenly realized what people were doing around you and were treating it as normal, you'd be outraged.
Yeah.
But in a way, we have this we have this challenge, because at the same time, that can undermine our compassion to the very people we used to be before we saw these things. and certainly undermines our compassion for the people we're trying to persuade. And that's a difficult balance. In a way, when you go vegan or you get serious about these issues, you give up one form of cognitive dissonance. It's very freeing, right? Because you see things as they are and you've withdrawn your participation from some of this harm at least. But in a way, you then almost have to take on another form of cognitive dissonance deliberately, because you have to keep that moral opprobrium sort of trapped away a little bit somewhere so that you can engage with compassion and help people see what you've seen. So
it's funny because I've just co-written a book on sort of how to help people change. And the first step, is to go from critic to ally.
Yeah.
And the first step is to examine your own negative emotions, your anger, your outrage, your frustration, and find your own positive intent.
Yeah.
So I think, if someone were to tell me, okay, you've just got to stop being outraged, I could maybe swallow it, in the interests of politics, but it would still be driving me. But if I can say, boy, I'm outraged, and I'm outraged because I care and I'm deeply compassionate, then all of a sudden I feel better about it. And I don't have to act from that place in a way that's going to get me the opposite of what I want.
Yeah, no, I love it.
So cool. I didn't know my work was going to be useful here, but I'm feeling pretty good about it.
Well, I look forward to reading it. Yeah, no, it fits in beautifully.
Yeah. Anything, we have many more things to talk about, but in terms of today's conversation, anything you want to add or sort of put a bow on or wrap up with that you think would be important? So
one thing I would say is that although sentientism is explicitly naturalistic, and I know that can sometimes be difficult for people who are very committed to a religious or a supernatural worldview, the important point is that it's just a way of describing this way of thinking. It doesn't mean we don't still have universal compassion for each other. It doesn't mean we don't share this sentiocentric compassion, that we should work together on campaigns together and drive for the same ends. This doesn't have to, it's not intended to be an exclusionary thing. I have enormous respect for, the rich veins of compassion that flow through supernatural and religious worldviews, and all of the online forums and groups that we've set up around the sentientism idea are open to everybody. So we have people from the Animal Interfaith Alliance and Catholics for Animals and spiritual but not religious people, who all are interested in these ways of thinking, but don't necessarily think of themselves as naturalistic or sentientist in the group. So they're all completely open. The idea is universal compassion, and we can work together on that end, regardless of the basis of what we think is real and what isn't.
Great. So where can people who are drawn to this or drawn to argue it in a good And I'd love to continue the conversation. So if people want to challenge it, ask questions about it, tell me I'm crazy, I love all of that. And if you basically search for the word sentientism anywhere, you'll find us. And sentientism, you got the pronunciation perfectly. It is just the word sentient with ism on the end. So we have a website, sentientism.info, which has links to all of our different forums and groups and writing and communities. I run a sentientism YouTube and podcast with 83 episodes so far, with fascinating range of interviews with not just philosophers, but also activists and CEOs and actors and world from screen and stage as well, which is fascinating. Because again, I don't want this to seem like a super deep academic philosophy. It's supposed to be, an everyday commitment to evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings that anyone can understand in a sentence as well. And then we have a bunch of different online forums and groups. So our biggest is a group on Facebook, but we have Telegram, Reddit, Discord, all of the other places people might expect to find us. And I'm on Twitter as well, at Jamie Woodhouse and at Sentientism. Gotcha. So if people wanted to go to one place as sort of the clearinghouse, they'd go to sentientism.info. That has all of the links. Great. All right. So I'll include that, and I'll get a bunch of other links from you and throw them into the show notes. And this has been beautiful. And I have a bigger smile on my face when we're finished than when I started. So
likewise. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and a privilege to reach out to your audience as well. I hope they find the idea interesting. Awesome. Well, thank you for all the work you do and for taking the time today, Jamie. Thanks, Howard. Take care. Bye-bye.
Check out the show notes and the links from today's episode at plantyourself.com/492. I'm going to be brief here because it's Wednesday afternoon, right before American Thanksgiving, and I want to be done, then I want to close down the office. So movement news, been doing more knee rehab, slow squats, running, of course, at Ultimate on Saturday, which doesn't seem to make it too much worse, but certainly doesn't help. And trying some more strengthening and stretching and foam rolling to kind of work that right knee out. Still a work in progress. Garden news, the county of Chatham, North Carolina, where I live, gave away free mulch today. So I drove down this morning with the pickup truck and got 2 scoops, probably, a cubic yard or maybe a little bit more, which is now going to go and cover all the weak beds. And so spent a bit of time shoveling from the back of the truck onto a tarp, which is then going to get carted and placed on all the beds. So that's the news from the garden front. All right, time for thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his beautiful song Sabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace. You can find more of Will's music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Brittany Porter, Dominic Maurer, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Tina Scharf, Tina Ahern, Jen Filkanovsky, David Bizek, The Mysterious Michelle X, Elsbeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Kelly Cameron, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Benham, Gila Sert, David Donahue, Blair Cyber, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesner, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, Aviva Lael, Alicia Lemus, Val Linneman, Nick Harper, Bandana Charlie, Molly Levine, The Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Scharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Koppel, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Sharon Hirschman, Linda Ayat, Holm Hedegaard, Isa Tuzinwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Olakoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Marani, Karen and Joe Crabtree, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Peter W. Evans, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Laurie Fanny, Linnea Lundquist, Emily Iconelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Leenan, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bilberry Elf, Marjorie Lewis, Tricia Adams, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunmarie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Mama Says, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Paranganchi, Amy Daly, Brian Tourville, Mark Jeffrey Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perryman, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Naik, Erica Piedra, Danielle Roberts, Michael Lushton, Sarah Johnson, Catherine Floyd, for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for now. As always, be well, my friends.